Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the monthly safety advisory call for December. Today we're going to be talking about the top 10 citations for painting and wall covering contractors that OSHA cited last year, 2022. Well, actually this year. I'll talk about those actual dates in a minute. And then we're going to go into record keeping. And we're coming to the end of the year where we need to not only post ours physically, but also do an electronic submittal of our OSHA 300A summary. So with no further ado, let's continue. In a second. So the 10 most frequently cited OSHA standards. We'll start by saying what we do. We go to OSHA.gov, and every year they post the data and statistics for what standards they cited. And they break this down by NAICS code, the North American Industrial Classification System. So from October 21 through September 22, these are the citations that were written for the painting and wall covering contractors, NAICS code 23832. Right. So our methodology, how we go about creating this list, we take all the citations written to that NAICS code, and then we start grouping like with like, right? So all of those that have to do with fall protection, whether that's lanyards or guardrails or whatever it is, that falls under, we group that as fall protection. Then anything having to do with aerial lifts, whether it's scissor lifts or boom lifts, we group into the aerial lift. Right. So that's kind of how our methodology goes. We group like by like, we then add them up, and whichever had the most citations written, that gets number one. And then number two, number three, as we go down. So how will you use this information? Well, this is a really good snapshot of where OSHA is writing citations for your industry. So it would make sense to look at these issues within your own organization and see where you have exposures and where you really need to make sure we're doing the right thing. And one of the reasons we have to do that is because of the penalties. As you know, this is tied to inflation and it continues to go up each year. This year, other than serious citations, have a maximum penalty of $14,502 per violation. And your other than serious are generally going to be your record keeping. Then you have your serious. Your serious citations are those that can lead to injury, right? So pretty much any standard other than record keeping generally falls under serious. And those have a maximum penalty of $14,502 per violation. Then we get to the big ones, willful and repeat, right? You are exposed to the possibility of a repeat citation if your organization received that citation within the last 5 years and they're citing you again for the same standard. When that's the case, they consider it a repeat. And repeat citations can carry a fine of $145,000 per citation. So we really get into a larger issue there. And then willful. Willful are those hazards that you're aware of and decided you didn't want to do anything about, right? Or you didn't do anything about it. Oftentimes, these are found when you have daily inspections that document what hazards we're finding, but you're not documenting corrective actions. We need to make sure that you document those corrective actions. Otherwise, all inspections that you record create evidence, right? But at the same time, as you'll see when we go into this top 10, you can't just not document inspections. Inspections are required. Now, posting requirements and failure to abate, both of these come after a citation is written. You're required to post that citation at the location where the violation happened. I believe it's for 3 days. And if you don't, there's a $14,502 possible citation for that. And then failure to abate, if OSHA gives you a date by which you need to correct that issue, each day beyond that abatement date, which is generally 30 days, each day beyond that, you end up with a $14,502 penalty. Right? And that's not the maximum penalty, that's the penalty per day. Right. And generally this is limited 30 days maximum as well. All right. So we'll start with number one. Shouldn't be surprising to anybody listening to this or watching this that fall protection is the number one citation written for the finishing contractors, right? We do a lot of work at height, and if we don't have that fall protection, we're going to get that citation. Your fall arrest systems need to be in good shape. We need to be in good condition. They need to be inspected prior to use. Right? We need to document that we're doing an annual competent person inspection beyond what the operator is doing. And we need to make sure that we've done training on all of those. So training falls into this as well. And then, of course, protection from falling objects. Right? So we need to have our toe boards set up, hard hats, and or barricade the areas underneath where we're working so that others can't enter them. All right, so number two, also, not really a big surprise, aerial lifts. Frequently cited, what we find is not documenting inspection prior to use. Right? We should be creating inspection by the operator prior to use each day, and we need to be documenting it. It is extremely challenging to prove to OSHA that you are performing inspections if you don't have any documented inspections. And additionally, operator training. Right? Aerial lifts are now known as mobile elevated work platforms, as ANSI put out a new standard. I believe it is in 2019, they put out a new standard, and that standard specifies what level of training is required. So not only do your MOOP operators need to be trained in a 3-year cycle, but you also need to make sure that anybody that is supervising those operating lifts are trained to that same level. All right, scaffolds, number 3. Scaffolds are easily visible, right? They grab attention. Once again, this is something that OSHA is always going to look at when they're on site. So we need to make sure that we've correctly constructed our scaffolds, that we have our toe boards in place, that we have our work areas fully planed, right? That we have a mid rail and top rail. Obviously, your cross braces, depending on their height, can serve as either a mid rail or a top rail, but they can't be both. Now, this will be known by anybody you've put through that competent person training, right? Erector and dismantler training is also needed. So we need to make sure we have that proper training for those who are operating scaffolds. Scaffolds also need to be inspected each shift prior to being utilized. So if you are not currently hanging an inspection tag on your scaffolding, this is something you're really going to want to implement. Hazard communication. Hazard communication can be very challenging when it comes to the finishing trades. We have a lot of different chemicals, and they're constantly changing what we have on site depending on what materials we're using. So we need to make sure that we have a well-defined hazard communication program. Right? Frequently cited things we see is not having a written program. Right? FCA offers a health and safety manual that includes a well-written hazard communication program, which would take care of that. Information and training. We need to train people on hazard communication annually. So if you're following the 52-week toolbox talk schedule that FCA offers, then you're going to be having those covered in that. Safety data sheets. Do we have them available? Does the foreman of the site have the ability to pull those data sheets? Do either people working in the field have the ability to pull those data sheets? It's not enough if only the foreman can access them. Everybody on site, or all of your employees on site, need to be able to access the safety data sheets. Now, if you have a physical safety data sheet book made up for each job site, and then kept in the gang box, that's a really good method of making sure that we have everything there. If you go to a digital format, that's acceptable as well, but we need to make sure everybody has that login and that requirement. And then labeling and secondary labeling is always an issue when it comes to hazard communication. If we have any chemicals on site that do not have GHS labeling and secondary containers that don't have that labeling, then a citation is likely. Now with secondary labeling, there is one exemption where we're allowed to pour into a container for immediate use, and when we're done, pouring it out. So example of that would be taking 5-gallon bucket, pouring it into the cut pot. And as long as the person that is using that cut pot poured it out of that container, the labeled container into the cut pot, uses it, doesn't leave it where they're not in control of it, and then pour it out when they're done back into that 5-gallon bucket that has labeling. There is not a requirement for secondary labeling in that one exception. But for everything else, we need to make sure we have that secondary labeling. Training and inspections. Number 5 this year was training and inspections, right? 1926.20.21. These are the, pretty much the lowest hanging fruit of what's required. The basic safety requirements laid out by OSHA say that we are going to train our people on what hazards they'll be exposed to and how to protect themselves from those hazards. And then we're required to perform periodic inspections of the work site to assess hazards. Right? So if you are not performing on-site inspections that are documented, and how often that needs to be performed depends on the site itself, right? But if you're doing anything less than monthly inspections of the job sites, OSHA will be writing a citation for it. So make sure that we are documenting our inspections on each individual job site, and that we are documenting the corrections we put in place. Not just what the hazards are, but document what we've done to correct it. That way, we find the hazards and we correct them, and we're not exposed to that hazard anymore, and we're not exposed to a possibility of a willful citation. Right? So when we have this marked as recognition training, the note on the bottom says this doesn't include fall protection, scaffolding, aerial lift, hazard communication, any of those specific trainings that tied into one of the groups that we're talking about here. We fit the training citations related to that issue in with that group, right? So these are just general training, new hire orientation, hazard awareness type trainings. All right, number 6, respiratory protection. Right, not really a surprise here either. We put a lot of material into the air. So we need to make sure that our people are protected. How do we do this? For respiratory protection, we need to have a written program. Right? Before we put somebody into a negative pressure respirator, we need to have a medical clearance, right? We need to medically clear them and make sure that they are healthy enough to utilize that equipment. Annually, we have to perform a fit test, right? Each year, a fit test has to be performed. Each year, we need to perform that training as well. And then this last one is pretty easy for OSHA to cite: storage and cleaning. Right? Anytime a respirator is not in use, it needs to be an airtight container. Right? So we need to provide those airtight containers, generally a Ziploc bag or something similar, and enforce that our employees are keeping their respirators in that airtight container when they are not utilizing it. We also should be providing cleaning opportunities for that. So whether that is 3M wipes that they can utilize to wipe that down, or access to a sink with cleaning agents, either way, we need to make sure we provide that for our employees. Number 7 is a pretty big group: occupational health, right? Those long-term issues that build up over time to cause serious health concerns. So we're talking about those VOCs, right? Gases, vapors, fumes, dust. And then specific issues: respirable crystalline silica, lead, asbestos, right? All of these are big issues. We need to make sure that we are assessing the hazards and protecting our employees from them. And this bottom one, occupational noise exposure, we need to make sure that our employees are having their hearing protected as well. With the amount of time we spend on ladders comes up, right? So we need to make sure that we're inspecting our ladders before use, that we're not using damaged ladders, that our ladders, when we're using it, could go from one level to another level when transitioning onto a roof or onto an upper level, that we have that extension ladder extending 3 feet beyond the surface, right? This is something that's easy to see. If you don't count 3 rungs above that upper surface, then they don't have 3 feet up there. So we need to make sure that that is there for transition. And then improper usage, right? If we are not, if we are leaning A-frame ladders up against a wall or doing something else like that, then we're going to have those issues. Stairways, actually, this is on here from the last time we did this, where we had citations written for stairways back in 21. We did not have any stairway citations this year, but it's good to keep on looking for that path of egress, uniform riser height, and handrails, right? If the general contractor has not put all the protections required on those stairs that are necessary, then we should not be using them. PPE, it's always something that OSHA is going to look at. So do you have a PPE hazard assessment for your routine tasks? You're required to perform that assessment for your routine tasks to determine what PPE is going to be required. And so most of the citations written this year were on eye protection, but appropriate eye protection and hand, foot, and electrical protection are things that also come up. Number 10 this year is electrical, right? And usually when we're talking about electrical with finishing trades, these are going to be hazards that you are exposed to that somebody else creates, right? So if we have live panels with cardboard on front of it that says hot, danger, right? That is not acceptable to paint around. We need to maintain distance from that. Right. So if the general contractor or the electrical subcontractor on a job are not appropriately protecting electrical equipment, we cannot work around it. Right. So we need to make sure that we understand what those requirements are and that our foremen are educated on what type of electrical hazards are likely to be met. And then I threw in 11 because we're talking about record keeping right after this. Right. So frequently cited issues is not keeping it, under-reporting, over-reporting, not posting that summary log at the end of the year, not electronically submitting that summary log at the end of the year, which is a newer requirement, right? And not posting stuff. We need to make sure that we have all that. It's typically other than serious, but we need to make sure we're doing it. This last bullet point, duty to report. We are required to call OSHA or report to OSHA. There's different methods we can do it. We can either call, we can do it in person, or we can submit over the internet off of the OSHA website. I always suggest the third. Reporting over the website is really the best way to do so. But the duty report says that we are required to report to OSHA if there's a fatality within 8 hours of us finding out about that fatality. We are also required to report within 24 hours any workplace incident that relates or ends in one person hospitalized, right? Amputation, loss of an eye. Right. So if we have any of those issues, we need to make sure that we call OSHA within 24 hours. And if there's a fatality, within 8. So another thing that we can find by looking at the information that our government puts out are the incident rate trends. So we can do this again through the Bureau of Labor Statistics at bls.gov, and they look at each industry by NAICS code to determine what level of hazards they have. So the industry average that you have is 1.8. TRIR, total recordable incident rate of 1.8. And that TRIR is a pretty understandable number. You can relate it. Okay, what that means is that many people out of 100 are going to be injured during the course of a year's worth of work, right? So having that TRIR of 1.8 says that we're hurting 2 out of every 100 people that work for us, right, as an industry. So what we need to do is make sure we cast a vision to drive that number down to 0. Measure where you're at, evaluate how you're doing against the industry itself and against your own prior performance, right? These are important numbers that we should be looking at. All right, so let's talk about record keeping. Record keeping is something that's pretty complex. There are a lot of concerns with record keeping. There's a lot of letters of interpretation. Now, when OSHA has a rule and a contractor or an employer questions what does this actually mean? Can you be more specific? Does this follow compliant or is it not compliant? And you send that letter into OSHA, OSHA will respond with what's called a letter of interpretation. And this specifies how they're going to react to things. Now, most standards have 1, 2, the letters of interpretation. The more complex ones have 10, 15, sometimes as many as 25. I believe there are over 100, I think pretty close to 200 letters of interpretation on record keeping. It's a very complex concern with a lot of gray area that can be very confusing. And that's why we're going to talk about it next. All right. Record keeping is a 5-step process. Okay, it starts with the question of, did an employee experience an injury or illness? Right. Step 2 is determining whether that illness or injury is work-related. Step 3 is determining whether or not it's a new case. Step 4 is determining whether or not it's going to meet the criteria that requires us to record it. And then step 5 is recording the injury if necessary. So here's a little flow chart for you. We're going to start with an employee experience an incident injury, right? If not, then you don't have to record it. But if they did, we move down to the next. Was it work related? Did it happen during work hours? Did it happen on work property, right? And there's some other details that we'll get to in a little bit. But if yes, we go down to the next question. But if no, if it's not work related, we don't need to record it. Is it a new case? And sometimes we'll get a no, right? In which case we have the old record keeping that it's tied to, right? Because a new case is always the case we're involved with. An old case has to be one that we've previously recorded, right? So if this is an ongoing injury that was previously recorded and is on a summary log from this year or a previous year, then we need to update those records if it's an existing injury. If it's a new case, we then go down to the next question. Does it meet their requirements? Right? Does it meet their requirements beyond first aid or transferred, right? Or lost time? So if no, if it doesn't meet it, right, then we don't record it. But if it does, we record it on the form. So let's go through each of these steps and get a little more detailed on here. Okay, definition. An injury or illness is an abnormal condition or disorder. Right. So usually when we're thinking of injuries, cuts, fractures, sprains, something like that. That's where we really run into issues with injuries. For illnesses, they can be both acute and chronic, such as skin disease, respiratory disorder, or poison. Right. If we have an illness related to work, then that may very well become a recordable. Another illness that is commonly found is noise-induced hearing loss. Right, so noise-induced hearing loss is also another illness that can lead to this. So, is it work-related? If you have an injury or an illness, let's determine whether or not it's work-related. So, did it occur in the work environment? Right? For the vast majority of concerns, if it did not occur in the work environment, then it doesn't count, right? It's not work-related, and we do not need to record it. If it is, then we need to write it as work-related. Now, what if you have somebody that has a bum knee, right? They injured their knee when they were playing football back in high school, and then when they were working, they stepped on something and their knee got injured. Is that work-related? Yes, right? If it's not only a new injury or illness, but a significant aggravation to a pre-existing condition is also considered work-related. So just because there was some injury already in, it may still be a new case, right? And it is going to be work-related if we significantly aggravate it. So what is the work environment, right? It is your establishment. So clearly your shop consists of your work location, but also the job site, right? Whatever job site your employees are working on is going to be considered that work environment. Pre-existing conditions, right? So when we look at pre-existing conditions, is it a new case, right? Well, we have somebody that had an injury from previous that they had recovered from, and it was significantly aggravated from an event or exposure in the work environment. If it results in death, loss of consciousness, days away, restricted or transferred, or medical treatment beyond first aid, then it's going to be a new case, right? That pre-existing condition doesn't stop it from being a new case. What if it's not work-related, right? Well, the vast majority of your issues are going to be work-related if they happen on the job site. However, if the employee is present as a member of the general public, right? Not much here within your specific area that would fall into that. But let's say that there was a grand opening facility or ceremony for a hospital, and one of your employees went to it even though they weren't on the clock and it wasn't a work function, and they got injured there. Well, technically it's your job site, but it wouldn't count, right? It would not count as work-related. Symptoms arising in a work environment that are due to a non-related event or exposure. I'm diabetic. If while working, I have my diabetes causes me to lose consciousness and fall, that would not be work-related, right? The symptoms arise in the work environment due to non-work related event or exposure. Voluntary participation in a wellness program, medical, fitness, or recreational activity. If we have a softball game for our employees, somebody gets hurt during that softball game, that is voluntary participation, then that is not work-related. And then when someone is eating, drinking, or preparing the food for personal consumption, right, that during lunchtime, they are eating food, they get coffee, they pour it on themselves, and they get burned by that coffee. That's not work-related. However, if that person was to be making coffee for everybody and spilled it on somebody or themselves, that may be work-related, right? If that was a work-sponsored issue. Personal tasks outside of assigned working hours. Right. Outside of our assigned working, I work 7 to 3:30. At 4 o'clock, I bring my kid over for a tour of where I work. It's not work related. Then that's not a work related injury if something happens to me there. right? Prumo grooming, self-medication, non-related condition, or intentionally self-inflicted are not work-related. No vehicle accident is work-related, right? A motor vehicle incident, including multiple motor vehicles, not pedestrians, but multiple motor vehicle incidents, those don't count as work-related injuries, right? And then common cold and the flu is not considered work-related. So looking to determine whether or not it is a new case. We can consider a new case if they've not previously experienced a recordable injury or illness of the same type that affects the same part of the body. Right? So if you don't have a previous recordable related to that, then we're going to say it's a new case. If we did have a previous recorded injury or illness and the employee completely recovered, meaning that the doctor released them back to full work, right? Signs and symptoms disappeared. They're no longer on medication for that injury and illness. No more signs and symptoms of it. Then it's a new case, even if it's the same body part, same issue. If we've completely recovered, then it's a new injury, right? If we have not completely recovered, if we're still taking the antibiotics from that initial injury, right? Or we're still going through physical therapy from that initial injury, then we go ahead and edit our existing case, right? Our existing records. So if we had somebody back in 21 that injured their knee, they are returned to work and are working light duty, and then they re-injure their knee and are going to have to lose time again. Is that a new injury? No, that's an existing injury. We update that case in our existing records already. Step 4 is determining whether or not it's a recordable, right? What counts as a recordable and what doesn't. So first of all, death, right? Clearly, if an employee dies, that's going to be considered a recordable. Days away from work, restricted work activity, right? Where we change their duties. Job transfer, where we change them to another job where they don't have to have those duties because they can't perform them. Medical treatment beyond first aid. We'll talk about what those specifics are in a minute. Loss of consciousness, right? Anytime the employee loses consciousness, then we're going to count that as recordable. Now, once again, that's unless it's by an unrelated physical concern, right? Like my diabetes, you could lose consciousness if your blood sugar gets too low. That would not be a recordable. Right. But if I was walking through the door, hit my head on something and lost consciousness, or a heat stroke caused me to lose consciousness, that would be a recordable, even if there are no other concerns. And significant injury or illness diagnosed by a licensed healthcare physician. Okay, so days away. How do we record days away? If you have one or more day away from work, it counts as lost time, right? We check boxes for the days away cases, and we count the number of days. We don't include the day of the injury. So if an employee gets injured and they're back to work the next day, then that would not be a day away case. But we count specifically the number of calendar days, not the days that they would have worked, right? We count weekends, we count holidays, we count vacation. We count all of those when we're counting the number of days away. And we cap that count at 180 days, right? If somebody is out 180 days, that is the top number that we're going to put, right? So if they're out 200 days, it still gets marked down as 180. If they're out 300 days, it still gets marked out as 180. You may stop counting those days if the employee leaves the company for a reason unrelated to the injury or illness, or if a medical opinion exists, you have to follow that opinion. So if the doctor says they can't come back to work for 30 days, and the employee says, "I'm good, boss, put me in," we still have to follow what the medical opinion states, right? Regardless of what the employee says. Restricted work. Restricted work is if you have to have that employee for one or more days change what their job is, right? Either light duty, or if they get changed to another job role because of a medical requirement. These would be included as counting the days restricted or transferred, right? We count days in the same way that we count them for lost time days. Each day, including weekends, including holidays, including days they weren't scheduled work, including vacations. But once again, we do not count that initial day of injury or illness. So if an employee is unable to work a full workday that they would have otherwise been scheduled for, or unable to perform one or more routine job functions, then it's restricted work activity. Okay, so routine job function is an activity performed at least once a week. So if there's any of those routine job functions that can't be performed, you have to consider it restricted, right? And it goes against that restricted or restricted or transfer, right? Okay, so also if the employee experiences minor musculoskeletal discomfort, right, but the healthcare physician says they're able to perform all their job functions, but you as a company decide that you're going to assign a work restriction that's not been stated by the medical professional, but you're going to put them in a work restriction simply as a preventative measure. That does not count as recorded restricted. Okay, you do not need to count those days restricted if you're doing it precautionary and you do not have a doctor saying that they need to be restricted. Job transfer. If an employee is assigned a job other than their regular job for part of the day, then we can consider it a job transfer. So even if you're doing part of the day doing what they normally do and the other part of the day doing a completely different job role because of the injury, right? Because they're unable to perform their assigned job the full day, that's considered job transfer. So having them being able to perform their job part of the day is not enough, right? We need to be able to do that job for their full day. So what is medical treatment beyond first aid, right? Medical treatment does not include going to the hospital or a licensed healthcare professional for observation or counseling, right? It does not include diagnostic procedures, right? So getting an x-ray does not trigger a recordable unless that x-ray finds some injury that the doctor is then going to write. But the diagnostic procedures itself do not count as a trigger. And then first aid, which we'll define a little bit closer here in a minute, but first aid is not considered a medical treatment. All right, so using non-prescription medication at non-prescription strength does not trigger a recordable. Tetanus shots do not trigger a recordable. We can clean, flush, and soak surface wounds without it triggering. We can cover that wound. We can use butterfly bandages or series strips and have it not be considered medical treatment. Right? Hot or cold therapy and non-rigid means of supports. such as utilizing an ACE bandage to wrap a joint. Those are not considered medical treatments. Those all fall under first aid and do not trigger recordable. An immobilization device used to transport victims to a hospital does not trigger the recording. We're also allowed to, or obviously we're not going to do this ourselves, but bring them into a medical facility where they drill a fingernail or toenail to drain that fluid from the blister underneath the nail. That is not considered medical treatment. Giving an eye patch is not considered medical treatment. We can remove foreign objects from the eye using irrigation, so saline, or with a cotton swab. And that is whether we have someone that's first aid trained to perform that or have that performed at the hospital. It's not a question of where it's performed. It's a question of what is performed. So removing foreign bodies from the eye using irrigation or a cotton swab does not trigger. And removing splinters or other foreign materials from areas other than the eye using irrigation, tweezers, cotton swabs, or other simple means is not considered first aid, is not considered a recordable. If you use those tweezers to get something out of somebody's eye, that is going to trigger a recordable. Other things that we are allowed to do that do not count as recordable is using finger guards, massages, and then drinking fluids for relief of heat stress. None of those will trigger a recordable. All right, so what that means is most first aid beyond that, any medical treatment beyond that, is going to trigger a recordable. Okay, then medical removal, right? If we have a blood level that we're looking at, we have to record a medical removal if they're removed under medical surveillance, right? And that is restriction of work activity or days away. But we're not going to record if we voluntarily remove somebody before they get to that removal level, right? So if somebody's close to that removal level and we decide to, restrict their work activity so they're not doing that task that gives that exposure, that does not trigger it. But once they've hit that medical removal, that is considered a recordable. All right, and step 5 is filling out the forms, right? We need to make sure we fill out the 300 forms accurately, right? 300 and 301. Your 300 and 301 need to be filled out within 7 days of the incident. We also need to complete an OSHA 300A form towards the end of the year. We need to certify that summary. We'll talk about that on the next slide, but we need to certify it and we need to post that where employees can see it, right? The OSHA 300A is a summary form and it summarizes what goes on in your facility. The 300 is a log of your injuries and the 301 gets specific on individual injuries. There should be one 300 that logs everything. There should be a 301 for every recordable day away, restricted, transferred injury or illness. And then the 300A, there's one form that we fill out at the end of the year. So your annual summary, we need to make sure that's certified. What that means is the senior establishment management official at your site. So whether that's a CEO, president, owner, whoever is a senior management official needs to certify that what is written on the 300A is correct, right? So if you're in an agency, then it's the senior establishment management official, and really anybody that's in that direct chain of command between the senior establishment official and the head of the agency, right? But for those of you who aren't working for an agency, it's that senior most person, right? The senior most management official in the company or at that site. But By site, I do not mean job site, right? Because as a finishing contractor, you'll have multiple sites, but you'll record them all under a single establishment, right? Those are transient work spots, and they all get recorded under a single establishment, unless you have multiple establishments. So if you have an office in Florida and an office in Chicago and an office in Texas, that would be 3 different establishments, right? But if you have one office in Chicago and you service, 100 different job sites over the year, then all of those are going to come into the single establishment of your location in Chicago. You have to post your 300A from February 1st to April 30th, somewhere where your employees can see it. And so we need to make sure that it's set where employees see it. Now, this is pretty easy in a manufacturing facility. You put it in the break room. But that's going to mean you're going to need to post that at each of your job sites. Electronic submittal. Electronic submittal is something that has recently started, and it is one of the more common record-keeping citations written. If you have 20 employees or more, then you have to electronically submit your OSHA 300 through the OSHA injury tracking application, which you can find on the OSHA.gov website. Right? Worst comes to worst, type in injury tracking application in the search bar, and it'll get you to it. But you have to fill this in by March 2nd each year. As far as updating and retention, you need to retain your OSHA 300 forms for 5 years, right? All those forms need to be kept. You need to update those forms well, not all the forms, but the OSHA 300 form, right? Your injury log, that needs to be updated throughout that 5-year period. So if you have a recurring injury, right, an injury that an employee did not completely recover from and then re-injured last year or the year before, then we're going to change the number of days away on that document that has already passed, right? As long as within that last 5 years, we have to keep them updated. You also have to retain copies from January 1st for 5 years following the year that they cover. Right, so keep those 5 years worth of records, past years taken care of, and then as you go forward, you can remove the last year when you do the current. All right, so that's what we have today. As far as questions, if you have questions, please reach out to the FCA Safety Helpline. There is a lot of gray. It's not all black and white when it comes to record keeping. And we'd much rather that you call FCA and ask the question on a safety helpline than put yourself in a situation where you may get cited for not knowing the ins and outs of a very complex standard. So hopefully you already are looking at those issues that we found in the OSHA Top 10 and getting ready to do your record keeping in the next month. So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to talking to you again. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and have a good Happy New Year. Thanks. Bye.